What's good, people? Welcome to the Escapism channel. I'm your host, Terrelle. If you're new here on this channel, I basically talk about video games, films, anime, manga, etc. In this episode, I'll be reviewing the anime adaptation of Uzumaki, Junji Ito's story, otherwise known as Spiral. I've got the manga here. I'm a big fan of Junji Ito's work. It was a few years ago when I first discovered his work. And as a big horror fan that I am, seeing horror transfused with the medium of manga was very fascinating for me. And I think Junji Ito now, in my opinion, is one of the best kind of horror storytellers of recent decades. And I'm a big fan. In the past, we've had a couple anime adaptations in terms of television shows that mainly of his short stories, and they've been released to mixed results. There's a few episodes that I think were done well in some of them, others I don't think were done correctly. And this is kind of like, as far as I'm aware, the first anime adaptation of one of his bigger stories and one of his more iconic pieces of work, Uzumaki. And what I plan to do is review each episode of the anime because they're releasing them weekly. So this is just my review of the first episode. I'm going to try and keep it light on spoilers, but I may say a couple things in terms of plot development. So I may assume that you've already seen it when you're watching this right now. But if you haven't, it shouldn't be too spoiler detailed. Now, this show, the leading up to it, this show was actually announced a long time ago. I think it was in 2019. This show was announced, so it's been a long time coming. It's highly anticipated, and I've been reading Uzumaki over the past week, in the lead up to it as a refresher, and it's filled me with a lot of excitement and anticipation for this show. And I would say it's probably been one of my most anticipated anime shows of this year. Now, I just finished watching the episode about an hour ago. And I've got quite a few thoughts I'd like to share on this very first episode of Uzumaki. Now, overall, I think this was a good episode and a relatively strong start to this anime adaptation of the story. But I do have some key concerns, and I think I'm going to air out my concerns first before I get into the positives. Now, my biggest concern with this anime adaptation is that it's only 4 episodes. Now, this manga is one of the bigger ones in Junji Ito's bibliography. I think it's around 600 pages. It was originally 3 volumes, and now they've done the deluxe where they put the 3 volumes together. So it's a bigger story. This isn't just a case of it being a short story, a series of short stories like some of his other books that have been adapted into anime. Now, interestingly enough, the structure of this manga does feel like short stories in a way, where you get each chapter focuses on a new element involving the spiral. And then they're like threaded together by the two main characters, Kiri and Shuichi. I think I pronounced that name incorrectly. Um, who are the two lead characters that are kind of prominent in all these different chapters, connecting the story together. But it is still one whole story. It's not a series of completely irrelevant short stories that are completely irrelevant to each other. So to hear that it's only 4 episodes was quite concerning. And then I didn't know what the episode runtimes were. So I'm thinking, oh, if we get 4 episodes around, the 45 minute to an hour mark, this could work and we could be on, good territory. But in actual fact, this episode was only 22 minutes long, including credits. So we're going to get just over an hour and 20 minutes worth of story here. So basically almost like a film, almost like an OVA anime film. Um, but I don't think that's going to be enough for a story this big. And obviously they're going to have to cut things out of this story, with a runtime that short and an episode count that short. But it wasn't until, and obviously I had my concerns before watching, knowing that, but it wasn't until I watched this first episode that I started to see where it could become a problem. And it's going to be interesting as I do this series of reviews for these 4 episodes to see how my opinion may shift as we see more episodes and to see what they do and what they choose to adapt. But this episode moved at a very quick pace, and it sacrifices some of the finer details within the build-up and structure of this story and the characters' relationships, especially the main two characters, because I don't know if when watching this first episode, if you haven't read the manga, you may not know that these two lead characters end up at the beginning of this story in a relationship. So they're partners, they're in a relationship. They're not just friends, they're in a relationship. I don't think you get that from this manga. So that's an example of how quick this story's moving, that it's missing out those smaller details. And there's a few examples of that I could give where there's just certain aspects in the build-up of this story that are missing because they're moving at such a quick pace and it feels a little choppy in some areas. Um, and because it rushes through some aspects of this beginning portion of the story, I think as a result, some of the moments in this portion of the story don't carry the impact that they did in the manga, which is a shame. Um, there is a character, a secondary character. He is a very kind of minor character in the story as a whole, but in this first aspect of the story, in the first few chapters in the manga, he plays a prominent part just for the sake of something that happens to him. But it's a school character, a male school character who's like a secondary character. Now, an example of what I mean. This character is basically attracted to a character named Azami, who is a key character in this part of the story. This is an example of a character who appears earlier in the manga, albeit with a brief introduction. But that brief introduction in the episode was missing. So when he does appear in this episode, it feels even more out of left field. Like, wait, who is this? And he seems like just a random character that's just appeared just to serve that immediate purpose. Whereas in the manga, you do get a little bit of a smaller introduction to him beforehand, so he doesn't seem as random. And that's once again an example of how this choppy editing and pacing is sacrificing a lot and they're trimming a lot. There's also certain elements of the horror where certain reveals with the horror come a lot quicker than they do in the manga, and they don't actually have their own moment to exist like they do in the manga. They more so are shown as like a thought in a character's head than an actual thing they witness in reality, if that makes sense. Which isn't necessarily problematic, but it's just a different presentation to a particular horrific part of the story that is I think it's just a bit different. So it's interesting, really. Like I'm compelled actually by it because I do love this story, and I'm compelled to see what other changes they make, and maybe they'll be able to do something with the further episodes that retroactively maybe makes this work a little bit better. I'm not too sure, but that is my key concern with this show is the changes or the short length of the show in it being just 4 episodes and what that means in terms of the pacing and how they're trimming so much of the story and how that kind of lessens the impact on some of the aspects of the story and the horror itself. The structure is also different as well in some areas. There's one element towards the end of this episode where they basically splice in a particular aspect that comes much later in the manga. And it's not necessarily a bad thing that they did that. I can only assume they did that just so that they could try and use a bit of build up to something. So they are definitely building up to something with that particular moment. It's something that happens in a classroom with a student. They are building to something with that moment. There is a payoff to that. But it may seem quite random in this episode because it's quite isolated, and that is because it is actually an element from further down in the manga, further along in the manga, that's been brought back to the beginning of the story in this episode. But I think that's just with the intention of them planting a seed so that there is something they can kind of build upon and pay off in an episode later. The choice to keep this anime presented in black and white, I think, was an excellent choice. It's very effective and helps create the atmosphere and capture the atmosphere of the manga really well. I don't think this particular story would work as well in color, so I do appreciate that they translated the black and white imagery of the manga into this anime. This first episode captures the iconic imagery of Junji Ito very well, especially everything that relates to the character Azami. She is the imagery revolving around that character is some of the most iconic of this story, and it's absolutely gripping when you read it in the manga. It really draws you in and it's quite horrifying. And I think this show, if there's one thing this episode did very well, was capture that and translate it really well, especially in motion. That's one of the most like beautiful things when you read manga and then watch an anime of the manga is seeing those images flow in motion. You know, you always got to imagine it when you're reading off the page. You look at the images, you imagine it in motion. but to see it in motion and see it flow. And I think what they did with her character in particular, there's certain elements of what happens to her character that require movement, is all I'll say. And the way that was captured and shown and the music that accompanied it, I thought it was very, very effective with this horror. And the soundtrack in general for this episode, I thought was quite haunting and quite foreboding. And I thought that was effective. And the voice acting was very good as well. And like I said, I love the manga and I'm really curious to see what they do with the rest of this series. I think it's off to a good start. I do recommend you watch it because for what's out right now in terms of anime, especially in this anime season that's just about to start or just started, and for what's come out for the rest of the year, this is quite unique. In terms of the horror, in terms of the black and white, in terms of the atmosphere, and in terms of the story itself and where it's going to go. So I do recommend you watch it, and I do think it's worth checking out whether you've read the manga or not. But I think even if you've not read the manga, I think it'll be kind of obvious that they're chipping away at story elements here, and it's quite chopped up a bit. I think that would be obvious to anyone because I just think the pacing is so fast. It immediately feels like, oh, slow down, or what are we missing here? It feels like we're going at a lightning pace. New information's constantly being served to you without that much time to digest it. So I think it, yeah, it stands out to me as just, oh, yeah, my initial concerns seem validated after watching this first episode that they're going to move very quick and some of the finer details are going to be removed, and that could result in the impact of some significant moments not really packing the punch that they did in the manga and that I'd want them to have in this anime adaptation. But that is my thoughts on the first episode of Uzumaki. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. That helped me out a lot. If you're new here and you enjoyed the video, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos, especially in this series of reviews, because I will be reviewing each episode each week. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to watch and comment below. If you've seen this episode, let me know your thoughts. If you've read the manga, let me know your thoughts on the manga in relation to this episode as well. If you're completely new to this story and curious about it, let me know your thoughts as you're going into it or your thoughts after you've seen it. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll speak to you guys in the next episode.